Is an author and a social critic, written many books, including The Call, The American Hour, Time for Truth, The Case for Civility, A Free People's Suicide, and he has a new book that could not be more timely, just coming out, called The Global Public Square, Religious Freedom and the Making of a World Safe for Diversity. Os Guinness, welcome to today's issues.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Great to be with you.
Oz, I'd like to begin by asking you to say something about the general state of religious freedom as it stands. I was thinking, knowing you were coming on, that you wrote this book obviously before the latest outbreaks of the killings in Egypt and the burnings of Coptic churches and so on. But from your standpoint, can you give us an overview? Is the cause of religious freedom gaining or losing ground around the world right now?
At the moment, losing. Put it this way. You've got two great extremes in other parts of the world. You've got government repression, take, say, Iran or China, and then you've got flagrant sectarian violence currently in the Middle East. It's said that the burning of churches in the last weekend alone is the worst violence on that level since the 14th century. And then, of course, you've got countries like Nigeria where you have Boko Haram. Now, my book is, though, not just about religious freedom over there. It's about the fact that we in the West, who've got a better record than most parts of the world, we're squandering our own heritage here. And I put it generally like this. Wherever religion is discounted, religious freedom is also dismissed. And that's the tragedy we're seeing in America.
Your book bases a lot on the concept of soul freedom. Tell us what that is and why soul freedom is so important.
Well, the term goes back to Roger Williams, the great Puritan dissident who was a champion of what he calls soul liberty. In other words, religious freedom is not liberty for the religious. No. It's a matter of freedom of conscience and religion and belief, as the Europeans put it. So we all have worldviews. We're all making sense of life, and it's the freedom at that fundamental level that links who each of us is and the way we interpret and want to live life. That's why religious freedom is so fundamental. And so I would argue in the book, I use the word soul freedom, soul liberty to get out of our current ruts, because as soon as you think it's something for the religious, it's easily dismissed. But, atheism is a worldview, too. And we've got to realize that every human being has a worldview. None of us can live without. So this question of how we live with the deep differences at the level of our worldviews, our faiths, is incredibly important in the modern world.
Talking to Os Guinness, author of a new book called The Global Public Square, subtitled Religious Freedom and the Making of a World Safe for Diversity, published by InterVarsity Press. I'm Tim Wildman with Ray Pritchard, and we thank you for listening to the program. Oz, what do you say to people, who sort of subscribe to that John Lennon song Imagine from, 30 years ago or whenever it was, where basically he's saying, the world would be better off if we didn't even have any religion. That's what causes so much strife, division, mayhem. And so I hear this, you hear this often by, critics of religion, especially when they don't like Christianity. They say, the world would be better off if we just didn't even have any religion. How do you respond? How do you respond to that?
Well, you could respond in all sorts of levels. Anthropologically, in other words, what are human beings likely to be? It is very, very unlikely, if not impossible, we'll ever have a world without religion. Because religion supplies the deepest sources of meaning and belonging. You can say other people's religions are false, as we who are Christians don't agree with, and we say that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. But even people who disagree over it, they need meaning and their belonging. So the world will never be without religion and worldviews. Now, to answer at a different level, when I'm talking to an atheist who's saying that, I would say, yes, tragically, religion has been a source of division and conflict and so on, and you can see that in our European and even American history to some extent. But think of what the secular ideologies have done. More people have died and been persecuted and oppressed under secular ideologies in secular regimes than all the religious repressions and persecutions in Western history combined. In other words, people say rightly, the Inquisition was terrible. The slaughter of the Albigensians was terrible. It was grossly terrible, evil under Catholic oppressions. But you look at communisms done in China alone, maybe 75 million died. In other words, our atheist friends have got to be much, much more humble. The real challenge for all of us is, in a day when everyone is now everywhere, as they say, how do we live with these deep differences without blowing each other off the map?
Well, that's a great question. Just address it, if you would, from the Christian challenge from Islam, both in the Middle East, but increasingly in Europe and certainly increasingly here in the U.S. How are we supposed to relate to? I said, let me ask this on a couple levels: to our Muslim neighbors who live down the street, to movements to bring in Sharia law. That's on another whole level. And then the burning of churches in Egypt. How should Christians respond?
Well, you've got three parts of the world. Let's keep them separate for the moment. We've got the West, led by the U.S. Then we've got parts of the world like the Near East, and then we've got other parts of the world like, say, the communist regimes. There's no way that religious freedom is going to come tomorrow afternoon. The tragedy is that we in the West, who have what James Madison called the true remedy, we had the most nearly perfect solution until recently, and we're blowing it. We're squandering our heritage. So let's start here and forget the Middle East for a moment. In other words, the problem in Europe, but certainly in the U.S., is not them, Muslim immigrants coming in and so on. The problem is us. If we knew who we were, if we knew how we behave when people come in our tent, put it in Arabic ways, then there'd be no trouble. In other words, the framers talked about what was called civic education. Every generation needs to be taught what it means to live some of the fundamental freedoms that are America. If we don't teach them to immigrants or whatever, then we can't be surprised that we have chaos. So the problem basically is us, not them. But you're right, the background context of this huge challenge is that the Western world is now a cut flower civilization. We have cut our Jewish and Christian roots. And there's an immense cultural, moral vacuum. And into that vacuum, you have on one side our secularist friends pressing, and on the other side, our Muslims pressing, not so friendly. And so, but I would argue the problem isn't them, it's us.
Why do you think, Oz, that you just mentioned that America and the West, we see what's happened in Europe, it's almost the Christian church, with the exception of what the Catholic Church, what loyal, folks, the Catholic Church still has, it's dead. I mean, Christian Church is pretty well dead in Europe. What do you and why do you think in the U.S. you said that we've broken away? Did you say from our Judeo-Christian heritage? Why do you think that? Why would anyone want to break away from their heritage, which has been so good to them?
Well, we've forgotten what the heritage is. For example, you listen to people like the late Christopher Hitchens, how religion poisons everything. What people like that forget is, where did our culture of philanthropy, giving and caring come from? Where did the universities come from? Where did the reform movements come from? Where did modern science come from? Where did human rights revolution come from? All of these are the so-called gifts of the gospel. And people just forget that. And much of the church, let's be frank, much of the church in America in the last 40 years or so has been shallow, vulgar, irrelevant. And when it has fought for Christian things in public life, often it's done so in ways that were misguided and muddle-headed. For example, Wilberforce, our great evangelical reformer, the maxim, do the Lord's work in the Lord's way. Many evangelicals have tried to do the Lord's work, but in the world's way. So Jesus told us to love our enemies. Much of the Christian right is known for its demonizing of its enemies and so on. So we have actually earned much of the shame that's come down on our heads.
I don't know. This is Tim. I have a hard time with that one. what you just said.
I'm sure you do. But
I have a hard time with that one because what do you mean by we've demonized the other side?
If you look at the Christian right rhetoric of liberals and atheists and so on, there is much that is simply, just take one example. I dislike the present administration's policy on religious freedom. Make no mistake. But you remember a couple of years ago there was a video going around saying that Obama was a Muslim. It was a scissors and paste job that had taken many, many speeches, cut out little bits, put others in different places. It was what the Bible would call false witness, and it was sent around by Christians, and it was vile. And that's just one example of 100. But whenever
that's a little group. I don't even know who they are. That doesn't represent mainstream, the pro-family movement or Christian thought.
That's absolutely right. You think of the pastor who burned the Quran. Was he mainstream? Not a bit of it. So he was an isolated individual. But we've all been tarred with a brush. Whether it's
it's unfair. I don't accept the criticism.
Of course, it's unfair. But how we responded it to being unfair. I mean, if you look at all the rhetoric, you'll see. And put it this way, Kim, or Ray, I'm not sure which of you are saying it. The saddest thing for me in America at the moment is the defection of young Christians, particularly evangelicals. And the major reason they're dropping out of the faith is their reaction to the ugliness of Christian activism. Now, I'm active in public life. Don't misunderstand me. But I'm saying, like Wilberforce, and my great-great-grandfather was a great friend of his, we've always got to do the Lord's work in the Lord's way. And any time we don't, it will come back and hit us.
Well, hey, I respect you greatly. I just disagree with that totally. I don't think that.
Which part do you disagree with?
I disagree that young Christians are leaving the church because of Christian activism.
Well, you just got to look at the polls. I'm afraid that's the sad reality.
Well, that's their problem.
Anyway,
if they don't want to say that's their problem. If they don't want to believe in the need to stand up for sanctity of human life and for natural marriage as defined by the Bible and those kinds of things, if they want to run away from that because they don't like the confrontation that brings with the world, the secular world, that's not my fault that they want to leave the church for that reason. That's silly.
I never said for a moment it was your fault, and I hope it's not my fault.
No, I mean my fault in a generic sense. That's not the fault. That's not the fault of the people who are standing for righteousness.
Well, I would say to you, compare the way Wilberforce stood with the way that many evangelicals have stood more recently, and we come out the worst today. Anyway, that's not the point of my book. My book has none of that in it. My book, and you know, there are endless reports, academic studies on religious freedom. And there's lots of good people fighting against oppression and persecution. What's missing in the debate, and I hope that's what my book has, is a constructive, positive vision of the way forward for America and the world. And I hope that's what will come across strongly. I very much believe in the positive things that we can do better. That's what my book's about.
Let me reset here. Oz Guinness is our guest, and Oz has written the book called The Global Public Square, subtitled Religious Freedom and the Making of a World Safe for Diversity. It's published by InterVarsity Press and available at bookstores everywhere.